I live in a remote village in northern Alaska, and I grew up with stories of old creatures and legends, but I've also seen some things. My village is roughly 250 miles northwest of Fairbanks, Alaska. It is situated in the mountains and surrounded by a national park, so there's already suspicion of supernatural entities there. Growing up, I was told about the Inuthligaruk, or the little people. These smaller humanoids are a smaller proportion, but they are very strong, very fast and very smart, and even speak an old dialect of the language of the area they live in. At a distant point in time, we lived alongside them and hunted for and with them out on Nuna, or tundra. But as one family was visiting another, a human's dog ate one of the little one's children, and began a grudge that some say still holds today. There are stories of people being lured away from their homes just to be tricked and left out in the middle of nowhere. There are also stories of them helping us humans in times of need, like from my village, caribou herded by a small blurry thing towards a group of people, according to a story from the 70s. And there was a good harvest of animals that fall. There are also stories of the Inukbak, big person, sometimes called Bigfoot by people, even though they don't always look like an ape. The old stories talk of giants that roam the land in silence or in anger. One story even tells of a cannibalistic one out west near Nome or Kutsebue. Back home they just come around when the caribou do, and will either be mischievous or watchful of humans. In my personal experiences, I've seen the little ones and the big ones. They both can resemble humans, or just a blur on the land. I believe they're part of another world or dimension, and that's why they cannot always be seen. But we may never know. Let me tell you more stories from my time in the wilderness. In my high school years, I was an avid hunter and provided for my family. I hunted caribou, moose, Dall sheep and even bears for my family and elders in my village. But some of these hunts can keep you on your toes, not only because of how stealthy you need to be, or because of how dangerous some animals can be, as I, 5'9" and 240 pounds at the time, have been flipped and tossed by caribou like a rag doll, but because you might have eyes on you at all times. This time it was mid-December, and it was clear and cold, nearly -45 Fahrenheit, with a slight wind chill and somewhere in the -50s. I set out to find some caribou and try to add some meat to my family's freezer. I left the village and drove for almost an hour before I came across a large patch of diamond willows near a place we call Beng Creek. There I stopped and glanced around with my binoculars. While I was stopped, I could hear rustling in the willows beneath me, but I thought nothing of it. As the time dragged on, I continued to meticulously search the land with my binoculars. I heard my name called out. Though some people pass it off as a figment of my imagination, I swear I heard my name being called out from the tiny willow forest beneath me. Something along the lines of, "Hey, Jack," as if a relative was calling for me. But there were no other people out there. I had taken the only snow machine trail in the valley, and the last tracks were blown over by the wind, so they had to be days old. As I started up my skidoo snow machine, the willow snaps became louder, and I raced the hell out of there. Now, across the valley from the first story, my uncle had a few traps for wolverines that same year. The con bears are his favorite, so he was teaching me, as I was 16 at the time, how to set them up for wolverines. We were parked at one of his sets when I looked into one of the small divots in the mountain and saw a tiny dark figure climbing up an incredibly steep mountainside. I picked up my binoculars and looked up, and when I did, the thing took what looked like its cape and slung it over itself. It almost resembled the hide of a grizzly bear, but it was about -30 at the time. It couldn't have been. I told my uncle, and when he looked he got freaked out, so we left. Keep in mind he has nearly 40 years of experience out in our homelands and doesn't even try to avoid bears on the trails. One fall, my family left the village to go pick up blueberries and cloudberries. We were travelling east when we spotted what looked like a person in the willows across the valley. They were standing in the willows that were about chest height for them, and waving like they needed help. So, as we're taught to do in remote Alaska, we turned and headed for them to see what they were in distress about. Upon arriving at the willow patch, we realized the willows were like 8 feet tall, and there were no vehicle tracks anywhere near it. That profoundly creeped us out, and we left very quickly. These stories have been head-scratchers for me, and I wonder what you will make of them. My favourite hobby is hunting, but without guns. I build my own bows and arrows. I've never hunted exotic animals, just those that aren't endangered. I respect nature. I'm not an activist, but I try not to harm natural sights. The animals I hunt, I eat. I don't do it for fun or likes. I was in the forest, one I'd never been to before, walking calmly observing nature. All forests have trees, rocks, rivers, but each has its own little quirks. I'd been walking for about 2 hours when I found some strange tracks on the ground, something I'd never seen before. They were sort of triangular and about 30 centimeters long. They belonged to a bipedal animal that seemed to jump, as each pair of tracks was about 50 centimeters apart. I thought it might be a giant toad with a weird foot or genetic deformity, and decided to follow the tracks, which led me through narrow spaces between trees and rocks. It was hard to follow them as they disappeared when they reached a big tree, bigger than others. I looked up at the leaves, but I didn't see anything, no trace. There were also no marks on the trunk, as if the creature had gone through the tree. I had strayed quite a bit from my route, but I wasn't lost. I knew how to get back. As I followed the tracks, the forest became denser, and sunlight barely filtered through the leaves. I felt someone or something was watching me. Every noise seemed amplified, the crunch of branches under my feet, the whimper of the wind through the trees. And I decided to keep going because I could hear a river. I carefully descended the hill, of course. The path was challenging, and there were spiders everywhere. I tried to move slowly, so I wouldn't fall and not be bitten. The tension grew with each step. Sweat slipped down my forehead, the adrenaline keeping me on edge, and every noise in the forest made me turn my head abruptly, hoping not to encounter anything worse than a spider. Finally, I managed to get off the path and reach the riverbank. It was an amazing sight. There's nothing more relaxing than the sound of water hitting rocks. The tension in my shoulder eased as I listened, but I couldn't let my guard down. I was starting to get hungry, so I assembled my bow, prepared an arrow, and stood still in complete silence, waiting for an unsuspecting animal to cross my path. I hadn't waited for very long before I heard something from up ahead. I crouched down and tried to stay as still as possible, preparing my bow and arrow for a successful kill if necessary. I tried to control my breathing and looked dead ahead. Something was starting to emerge from the trees. It was a deer, but it was mangy. I started to put my bow back, because there was no way I was going to kill this. I wasn't going to eat that. It looked, well, disgusting. I started to get up, expecting the deer to see me and flee. But the deer did something I hadn't anticipated. It stared me down, its dark eyes locked onto mine, which kind of unnerved me, and it made me have to turn away. When I looked back, it was still there, almost challenging me for coming into its territory. It was a buck. Maybe, because of whatever disease it had, it wanted to challenge me. But I had no time for that. I decided to approach it to try and make it run, but it didn't. At this point, I decided my best option is probably just to go the other way, as I really doubted the deer would follow. And as I began to walk, I started to hear the clomp of its footsteps behind me. I turned around, and it was staring at my back. It kept on looking at me. I was starting to worry it would charge, something I personally had never experienced, and honestly with a big beast like that, something I didn't really want to happen. so I moved faster and further away, but I didn't want to run because I was scared if I started to run it would chase me down, which was odd behavior indeed. I walked quickly and found an appropriate tree and started to climb. When I got a fair distance up, I looked down, and the deer had pretty much stopped at the base of the tree and was tilting its head up, staring at where I was. I looked down at it, almost challenging it to do the same, but of course it couldn't. That's when it started to walk back the way it had come. I was feeling relieved. I really wanted to get about my business of hunting and wanted to make sure that deer was as far away from me as possible. I stared at it while it was making its way out of sight. And then, once it was gone, I jumped down from the tree. The next few hours passed by pretty slowly. I tried to find something to hunt, couldn't find much and ended up shooting a bird, which was just about enough meat, and put it in my bag and started making my way back. When I was about half hour from the exit, did I come across the mangy deer again. But the thing that really got me is that this time, as I was passing by it, it was almost like I surprised it. And one of the things that shocked me the most was that it was on its hind legs. I looked at it looked at me, and immediately it put down its feet, almost intentionally. Like I had seen it do something it shouldn't do. I gave it a weird look. Must have been that disease it had, I told myself, and just carried on going. After walking for about a minute, I chanced to glance back, and once again it was standing on its hind legs. This was starting to creep me out. Was it going to chase after me? I didn't want to find out, so I just ran for it. Years later, when I was speaking to some friends, they told me that it was quite possible what I had encountered in the woods was a skinwalker. I'm not sure if I believed them or not. Maybe just some mangy deer, not some kind of witch, monster thing. But nonetheless, it made for an interesting story, and when I dwell on it, am I really sure of what I saw? Could it have been one of these fabled monsters? I guess I'll never know. If it was, I'm glad it let me be. This happened to my mum. A few months ago in rural Montana, my mum took her dog outside to potty in the middle of the night. She had a big yard and her dog would go off its leash. While she waited for her dog, my mum said she heard a strange whistling. She would have thought it was a human, except whatever it was didn't seem to need to breathe. The sounds were continuous. She described it as a combination of every dog whistle you could imagine all at once. She was convinced that some creature was attempting to lure her dog away into the wilderness. But her dog didn't seem to react to the sound and returned to her after doing its business. A few days prior, my mum and stepdad had been rockhounding near their home and saw what looked like two large-footed dog tracks going across the road that had an 8-foot stride. She thinks this might have been the work of a dogman, the cryptid dog that walks upright on 2 feet. As a child, she had a Bigfoot encounter. She is terrified of and believes in the existence of cryptids because of this. When I came to visit her this summer, she wouldn't let me take out the dog after dark, and she wouldn't do it either. She very frantically and emphatically made me promise to not go out after sundown. There were several strange occurrences at her home over the summer that I saw for myself. Here is one more thing that she experienced. Deep in the backcountry of Montana, my mum was hiking up a mountain to get to a crystal dig site. She got separated from her group near the end of the trail and was the first to reach the top of the mountain. As she stood on the trail, she saw what she described as a 4 by 6 foot black piece of silk whipping through the trees, hovering about 8 feet off the ground. She was startled but not afraid, as she sensed that the thing was aware of her presence and was fleeing from her as quickly as it could. She said it moved like the Ewoks moving through the trees in Star Wars. This occurred in 2017, and ever since then my mum has posted countless places online asking, Has anyone else seen this black silk thing in the woods? And for years no one ever had. Recently, however, a group that studies this sort of thing reached out to her and asked for more details and informed her that this appeared to be a new phenomenon, but sightings have been on the rise. She is still seeking out other stories and experiences like hers to shed light on what might have happened, and so far has been unable to find any stories like hers. I have always been an avid mountaineer. When people say they go to the beach for vacation, I respect it, but I prefer the mountains. Something about these old giants has always fascinated me, as if I can't avoid but be drawn towards them and be in awe when hiking on them. Over my short 21 years on this earth, I consider that I have seen a fair amount of mountain ranges, from the Alps in Europe, the Pyrenees in Spain, the Italian Dolomites, the Czech Stawol Mountains, and I have always hiked and camped outdoors a lot, with family, friends, but also by myself. Now, I went to the US for college, and have always been tempted to do a part of the Appalachian Trail. From the pictures I saw on the internet, I always wanted to see them in person, and not gonna lie, I must say that the great amount of scary stories on these mountains always attracted me a little bit as well. I'm definitely not a person that enjoys scary movies or anything, but I enjoy hearing fellow mountaineer experiences, and to be honest, I mostly read stories about the Appalachian Trail to know how to prepare myself for when I was going to do it. The scary stories just got my attention every now and then. That being said, I decided to go this year and do a small part of it. I wanted to do a small part between the borders of Tennessee and North Carolina, with Clingman's Dome being the icing on the cake. I was a bit hesitant to go by myself since I'm not very familiar with both the geography as well as the wildlife in this part of the states. I wanted to go with my friend or girlfriend who is from North Carolina herself, but both my friend from Germany and my girlfriend declined as they had to work. So I decided I just had to go by myself, since I was graduating this year and would need to return to Europe. I started at this place called Bryson City and walked along the Tuckasegee River until I reached the Nolan Creek trailhead. From there on, I just followed the trail until I would reach Clingman's Dome, and from there I would just follow the Appalachian Trail for about a week. I had prepared well for this trip. I carried bear spray, pepper spray, I read some freaky stories about people on there, and also brought this hunting knife and an axe for wood. I had some canned food, and for the rest, just my tent and sleeping bag. So when I started walking away from Bryson City, I saw the beautiful aura this mountain range had, and I couldn't be happier. I had been wanting to do this since I had arrived in the States, and I was finally doing it. I encountered some people on the Nolan Creek trailhead who were friendly, but I had made up my mind that I would be better off alone than with strangers. I reached Clingman's Dome the same day and went a little further before I would set up camp. It was beautiful. At night I slept a bit off the trail with a small campfire while I had dinner, and before I went to sleep I made sure to put it out. The first night went super well. I was also exhausted from the hike to Clingman's Dome. The next 2 days were just as beautiful, and I saw lots of breathtaking views. The people on the trail I encountered were super polite as well. Then, on the third night, I feel like everything took a strange turn. I had set up my camp, as usual, around 160 feet from the trail. No one was camping close to me, or at least not that I was aware of. While getting dinner, I had this super weird gut feeling that I was not alone there. I felt as if someone was looking at me from behind a tree or something like that. I tried to just convince myself that I was having an amazing time, that I was safe, and that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went to sleep and put the fire out as usual. Then, before it was daylight again, I woke up. I woke up with the same gut feeling, that even though I was in my tent, someone was watching me from a distance. I didn't hear a single bird, which was strange, because right before daylight is when they start chirping again. I only heard the wind and the leaves. It made me feel uncomfortable, a bit scared even. I didn't fall asleep again, and the first thing in the morning after having breakfast in my tent, I broke up camp and decided to continue my hike. During my hike, I encountered a few people, and again they were very nice, but I stuck to myself. While walking on this part of the trail by myself alone, I felt observed again. I even had the feeling as if something or someone were following me. So every now and then I would stop dead in my tracks in order to hear if it was real. Now, obviously my mind could just be playing tricks on me, but I would swear that I heard the steps stop a second after I had stopped. So according to me at that moment, someone was following me. I looked around me the whole time and I never saw someone or something, which made it even more weird. After the long day of hiking, I made camp, this time closer to the trail than usual, because for some reason I thought it would be safer. I again had this gut feeling of being watched while having dinner outside my tent, so I decided to finish it up in my tent and I went to the bathroom in a bottle because I didn't want to go outside now. I tried to sleep by closing my eyes, but my mind just focused on hearing the whole time. And that's when I heard it for the first time. A knock, as if it were a branch hitting a tree or a small rock being thrown at the tree. Silence followed for what seemed like an eternity, but probably was no more than 10 minutes. Then again, this time clear. I was scared now. I had no idea where to go since it was dark already. I put on my flashlight in the tent and made myself as big as I could so that my shadow outside the tent would look bigger because of the light. I held my hunting knife in my hand, and the silence had followed with a second knock. But now I shouted to pierce the silence in the dark. First, I shouted that whoever was joking around, I was armed, and did not want to be pranked. And I thought this would scare them off, but it didn't. It was almost as if this person found it even more funny knowing I was pissed at them. I heard another knock, and immediately after, a knock on what I assumed to be the opposite side from my tent. So now I was guessing it was 2 people instead of 1, as they liked to pull a prank on an innocent passerby. I tried to stay up as long as I could, but around 4 AM my eyes just gave up and I dwelled off. I woke up at 8 AM again with the lights of the sun being my savior. I first tried to hear if whoever was pranking me was still knocking. I didn't hear anything. I shouted again, stating that I was now going to exit my tent with my knife in hand, and that whoever had been joking should make themselves known. I walked out the tent, but didn't see anyone. I looked for tracks around the camp, but could not immediately make anything out. I decided to get out of there. The next part of my week was basically the same. At night I'd hear some knocks from different directions, and occasionally I would hear what I guess was a little bit of humming, like as if a person were humming a tune. I never saw anyone except from the occasional hiker on the trail, so I can't say I saw something weird, but I never shook off this weird feeling of being observed and followed during the hikes. When I returned, I commented this to my girlfriend, and she said it was probably my mind playing tricks on me. I'm willing to believe her because I never saw anything. But I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I'm in that tent in the middle of nowhere, and someone is watching me and knocking on a tree. And every time I wake up like this, the thought alone petrifies me. Does anyone know what it could have been? I had this unexplainable incident happen to me while hunting several years ago. This is certainly not your typical hunting story. I was new to the area and drew my first antelope tag in the area known as the Red Desert, and I specifically scouted a remote location known as Bison Basin to hunt in. This area is probably one of the most remote areas in the lower 48 and great area for antelope hunting. But all that's really out there is some oil and gas production and uranium mining operations. Long story short, I shot an antelope about 150 yards away from me and 200 yards from my truck. I walked out to where it dropped and filled out and attached my tag. That's when I looked up and noticed off in the distance on the horizon a bright light moving quickly, but it was hard to gauge the speed because it was probably a good 10 miles off in distance. You can see for miles in all directions out there. One thing to note is that time and distance intervals are important to this story. With antelope meat, it's important to get the animal cooled off as quickly as possible, or else the meat can taste kinda funky. So I was in a rush to get the animal field dressed and back to my truck so that I could pack the body cavity with ice. That being said, I tagged the buck, looked up, and saw the light on the horizon, thinking nothing of it, and quickly went to work field dressing. In a matter of 45 seconds, I had opened up the body cavity and removed the guts. That's when I glanced up and noticed about a mile away or less that the light that I had seen in the distance was approaching me with incredible speed. In the last 45 seconds, it had covered a distance of what I estimate to have been 9 miles, and was approaching me at this speed. I couldn't tell what I was looking at, as the light was bright and flying over the top of the sagebrush and making no sound. As the light got within 200 yards of me, after observing it for a few seconds, I could make out what it was. It was a rectangular shape of polished metal, about 5 foot tall and 2 to 3 foot wide, like a dressing mirror, and it was reflecting the setting sun which was behind me. The flying object then dropped down below the sage and I didn't see it anymore. It made no sound, but was close enough to me that I should have heard engine noise. I was shocked and spooked. I wanted to get back to my truck and leave, but I had to take the animal. I bent over and hid below the sage line and quickly finished field dressing and grabbed the leg and took off running the antelope back towards my truck. This all took a matter of a minute and a half before I was completely gassed, so I stopped and looked back to see if the light was anywhere to be seen, and I could now see the light blasting off in the opposite direction, again going back 8 to 9 miles towards the horizon, moving faster than anything could possibly travel over that terrain. It was still reflecting the setting sun back at me. It eventually disappeared over the horizon after a few seconds, and I finished dragging the animal to the truck and get out of there. I don't know what I saw, but I know that it wasn't a drone, SXS, or any kind of low-flying plane. I would have heard engine noise, and that terrain could not be covered at that speed by any kind of vehicle with wheels. I even went as far as to ask Fish and Game and the uranium miners if they ever operated any kind of drones that could perform like that, and they said no, but I know it wasn't a drone. I haven't been back to that area since. A few weeks ago, I was driving in the middle of nowhere, heading to one of my friends. My wife was sleeping next to me, while my teenage daughters were watching a movie in the back. Next to them, my toddler was playing with his toys. It was around 1 a.m., and I was nervous as the drive there seemed to last forever. The dirt road with no lights gave me chills, as all I could see around were only fields. The road had many holes, and I was trying to avoid them as much as I could. I was very focused on that when I saw in front of the car a piece of luggage. It was in the middle of the road, on my side. On the other side, a car was parked facing us. The car was completely in the dark as there were no lights inside or out of it. I didn't want to drive over the luggage, so my first instinct was to go out and move it. I was lucky to have my wife with me. She grabbed my hand and indicated something on my right. A person was in the field, sometimes looking at his phone, the reason for which my wife saw him in the first place. I turned my car around and was ready to leave the road when 2 people jumped in front of us from the field. There was no space on the road, so I couldn't go without harming them. 2 people were in front of my car. 1 luggage, a car, and the person checking their phone in the field were behind us. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I thought of. I turned around again, facing the luggage, and drove over it. Fortunately, there was nothing inside to damage me or the car, and we got out of the situation unharmed. We arrived at my friend's house and everything was perfect, and we had a great time. However, I still have chills when I reflect on this incident, and I'd rather never meet those people who were out in the fields again. At one point in my life, I thought myself the luckiest man on earth. I was 23, had been a cop for a year, and was engaged to the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. Life was great with my parents. Me and my fiancé had just gotten a place together in a gorgeous 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and we were talking about having kids, where we would have our wedding venue, and overall, how we would want to spend our life. The job as a cop was stressful, but I had a passion for it, wanting to make a difference in the community. I never cared about having power. To me, the badge was just to identify as who I was. All I really cared for were the people in my community and protecting those I cared for. However, you cannot reason with such a corrupt and broken system that only wants to protect itself. The captain was an arse who fed on power. So one night, after getting off very late and heading home to be with a girl I loved so much, it had been a very long day. I was very stressed. I was involved in a high-speed chase that ended in a very physical and brutal fight with the suspect. I was tired and just wanted to put my head on her shoulders. I walked into our bedroom and was greeted with the sight that would change my life forever. My fiancé was in our bed with a man who happened to be my best friend. He had been my best friend since we were 8. And what do I find? The woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and the man I thought to be my best friend, making the ultimate betrayal. She was shocked. They looked terrified. I was shocked to see what I was seeing. As you can imagine, a huge fight occurred. I won't go into too much details, but they ended up leaving together, and from there things just got worse for me. Those two actually got together, and my whole world was destroyed. Being betrayed by the woman I envisioned spending the rest of my life with, and the man that was my best and closest friend for so many years. Not long after, I started arguing with my parents on a daily basis. They actually ended up supporting those two getting together, and with increasing tensions in my police department, I resigned. My life was crumbling. I didn't know what to do, and I decided I needed a break, and I was going to spend the week in the wilderness to gather my thoughts and see where it would take me. I packed up a sleeping bag, left my phone, wallet, and everything else at my house, and just headed out. I decided to go to an area about an hour away where it's nothing but forest for miles and miles. I pulled my car up to a dirt road near the direction I would be heading in and hid it behind some trees so no one would know I was out there. I got my backpack with all my equipment out and headed off into the forest. I tried to just put everything behind me. I walked for miles and miles up steep hills. I sat by a river for a couple of hours and then found an area where I would be sleeping. I didn't bring a tent, just a sleeping bag, and managed to get comfortable resting my head on a small pillow. I just kept thinking about everything that had transpired, from my fiancé to resigning from the force, and I finally managed to get some sleep. I woke up sometime in the night. I wasn't sure what time it was when I woke, but I was awoken from my sleep. I felt hazy and very tired, but I wanted to know what had woken me up. I started to get that eerie feeling like I was being watched. I had brought my Glock with me, as well as my hunting knife for my protection, as the woods can have creepers lurking in the shadows. That's when I saw a light from somewhere in the distance. The heck? I thought to myself. Was there someone else out here? Was I getting paranoid? I got my gun out and loaded it. I stood up from my sleeping bag and began heading for the mysterious light, but it faded out. I shouted, "Whoever's out there, show yourself. I'm armed." But as you would imagine, I got no reply. I still had that eerie feeling that I was being watched. I headed back to my sleeping bag, packed up, and went over to a different spot. But the feeling persisted. I laid down with my firearm near me and knife by my side, and I managed to fall back asleep. When I woke up, it was daylight. The sun was shining. I had nothing on me to tell the time, but I guess it must have been around 11 a.m. I sat up and looked at my surroundings, and I saw right by me footprints in the dirt. I began getting nervous and started trembling. That's when I saw the hooded figure standing in the distance. It was facing me with its head down, and I jumped up faster than I ever have before in my life. I pointed my gun and asked, "Who are you?" But the figure didn't move. I had my finger ready on the trigger, but couldn't help but feel nervous. That's when the figure finally looked up at me. Whatever it was didn't appear human. The face was pale. It didn't have lips or eyes, just holes where they should have been. I knew my life was in danger, and I ran so fast out of there, leaving everything behind. Backpack, sleeping bag, everything. I didn't care. I didn't stop running. I fell over several times and ran into a tree, nearly knocking myself out. I finally got to my car and floored it out of there. It was fortunate that I kept the keys in the pocket of my jeans. I looked to see if it had been following me, but didn't see anything in my rearview mirrors, and sped away until I finally got home. I rushed inside and locked my door before collapsing on the bed from exhaustion. I checked my phone, which I had left on the nightstand charging, to find I had over 200 missed calls. I hadn't told anyone where I'd gone and only been gone for a day, so I didn't understand why I was being flooded by messages. And that's when I saw a message that would send me into a deep state of depression. While I had been gone, my ex and former best friend were involved in a fatal car accident. My mother had been urging me to call her back and asking why I wasn't answering. I never went to their funerals or anything. I ended up packing my car full of my belongings and left for New Hampshire. I wanted to isolate myself from the people here. Too much hurt. I found a job as an emergency room technician in a hospital. I don't know if I'll ever get with a girl again. My heart is still broken. I don't know if I can ever feel the same way again. But what I am sure of is that I hope I never see whatever that thing in the forest was again. And I'd rather not find out. One of my eeriest experiences was back in 2005. I was 15 when Hurricane Katrina first hit, and we had no power, food or water for almost a month. So we went to North LA for a while until things settled. But when we came back to see the damage that had taken place at our home, my parents assessed everything while I took off walking in our backyard, which was now just swampy marsh. About 5 minutes down a little trail, which I frequented most days, I was just mindlessly walking when I looked up and was face to face with a black panther. She was all black, and I vividly remember her thick, black, shiny tail. We were about 15 feet apart, if that, and I froze in fear and honestly thought I was about to die. She stood there with her paws on the ground, one lifted up like I'd caught her off guard. We stared at each other for what felt like a lifetime, and before I knew it, she hissed and turned the opposite way and was gone. I melted and fell to my knees because I was so scared. I ran home crying and found out later that several other people in my county had seen a black panther that same week. For several nights, I swear I heard her outside my bedroom window in the swamp, screaming. I thought it was a woman being murdered, until my mum told me it was probably the female panther calling for her mate. One of the craziest stories I have. Not long ago, some homeless people near me were on the news, showing they'd found large cat prints and also had seen the black panther on the river. And about 3 weeks ago, I came home from work and found a 14-foot gator in my backyard. He was killed, eaten, and some really nice accessories made from his skin. But the thing with the panther is something I'll never forget, and maybe it's something most people won't understand, as they probably haven't been face to face with an animal that can literally tear them apart in seconds with no hope of escape. The absolute ice-cold fear that fills your body is something I don't wish on anyone. I live in Ontario, Canada, close to Toronto. I heard the news that tonight there would be a chance to see the Northern Lights again. This past Monday, I went and saw them and wanted to take the opportunity to see them again. Last Monday I went with a couple of buddies, but no one was available this time. The plan was to drive 4 hours to Algonquin Park, hike in the middle of the forest, make a campfire, smoke some Marlboros, and drive back after stargazing. I ended up driving about 2 hours there before my friend sent me a text, showing me there's no real forecast for the northern lights. So I decided to go up and just stargaze anyway. I drove up another hour, and at this point it's 11 PM in the middle of nowhere. No signs of humans other than the road in the pitch black. I was on call with my buddy since it was pretty boring driving up, and I started mentioning how beautiful the stars looked. My buddy then recommended I pull over and take some pictures. I ended up pulling over, turning off all the lights in my car while leaving it running, and standing beside the forest. For about 5 minutes everything was fine. Then I was admiring the stars, gushing to him about it. Right about that time the forest went completely quiet. There were zero sounds other than the wind and the trees. I immediately felt like something was wrong and went to grab my flashlight to see if there was a bear or something. I walk a little bit into the woods and turn on my flashlight, and I end up hearing a rustling noise and turn around to see this thing standing on its hind legs with a bright orange/red glow in its eyes. It was about 50 meters away. I start mentioning what I'm seeing to my buddy when all of a sudden my signal goes dead before I stare at it for a second until it starts sprinting at me with full speed. I immediately go into fight or flight, dash into my car, and go as fast as I can to flee. I'm usually a pretty casual guy and not spooked by much, but I was shaking, crying and sobbing, and trying to run as fast as I could. I begin spam calling everyone I know until I can get a hold of my best friend and start crying and sobbing about what happened while freaking out. At this point he just wants to check in to see if I'm okay. I start describing what I saw to him and that I believed it could be a skinwalker. It was this super unnatural looking thing that really spooked me. Right around here is when I feel all the muscles in my body start becoming sore and cramping up. It turned out when I had initially dashed to my car, I basically output all the force I could to get away. I'm an ex-rugby player/powerlifter, so my instincts were forcibly making me get out of there as quick as possible. After around 30 seconds of saying the name, I see the figure on the side of the road following me with its head and glowing eyes. I start hyperventilating, freak out more, until he calms me down and tells me to get out of there. I look for a way to make a U-turn but couldn't find anything. At this point I drive another 15 minutes before I can find anywhere to turn without stopping. I start to slow down and turn before I hear this ear-splitting scream sound from my window before I gun it back in the direction I came. I started freaking out more, telling my friend as everything was happening before I started getting a sinking feeling in my stomach that something was watching me. I start to look over the empty roads and see nothing. All of a sudden my signal goes out again, and I hear the screaming sound and see a kind of humanoid body in the fetal position on the side of the road. I then see its head look up and stare at me. I flee, and can't get the goosebumps and sinking feeling to stop. I end up trying to calm myself down with my Kanye CD, and hear something tapping my sunroof. I don't know how, but I knew something wanted me to open the sunroof cover and look through. I prevailed and never looked, but never lost that sinking feeling. I would hear the tapping sound for about an hour until I reached a small town. At this point I've gotten a hold of my friend and puked in my car. I'm just trying to get back as fast as possible, and he's telling me to describe Elden Ring lore to him to calm down. I then manage to calm down, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still on me. To preface this, I was the most brazen and ignorant of my friend group. They were all locals, and my family was from the city. This particular incident occurred on a very dull night in the middle of summer. We were all around the age of 18 to 19. Since it was such a small town, there was hardly anything to do, and most of us were unemployed and had no early morning obligations, so naturally this turned into an all-night misadventure. Two of us, me being one, were notorious adrenaline junkies. Now, if any one of you has ever lived in a small town, you'll know how utterly dull it can be, especially for younger people. which turns into all forms of juvenile entertainment in a desperate need for stimulation. Our idea for stimulation that night was to steal some road signs. It was a thing we did somewhat often when all other ideas failed to suffice. We usually targeted only interesting ones around the county. By this point we had gotten all of them, so we decided to go a county over. In the friend group there were 5 of us. One happened to have their mum's GPS system, and we found a sign that I absolutely had to have: Loveless Lane. And off we went. I don't remember what time it was, but it was definitely past 11 PM. We didn't want to risk anyone being awake while we broke the sign off the post. This particular road sign was at a dead-end backcountry road. On the way in, we spotted a tractor crossing sign. My best friend Kieran was thrilled and thought it was hilarious, so we all decided to steal it on the way out. Now this specific sign was metal and not the usual fiberglass that was used for road names, so we couldn't simply snap it off. We'd have to either pull the whole post out of the ground and wrench it off or use tools. The sign was directly across from a gravel driveway. We never felt any unease going down the road, but all acknowledged we were very much in the middle of nowhere, and it was of course extremely dark. The only thing to note was the sheer amount of wildlife out on the roads: several possums, raccoons, a coyote, and a few deer. All very common to see, but not usually on that same trip and road. I made a joke about how it was like a safari drive. We get our Loveless Lane sign and head back out. We came up with a game plan to steal the tractor crossing sign. Sam was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and Carl was in the seat behind me. There were 2 girls in the back, and when we got closest to the sign, Sam didn't want the risk of getting hit in the road, so we opted to kill the headlights and pull into the gravel drive. Sam then covered the interior lights with their hat to avoid any risk of being seen. Carl and I were supposed to jump out and quickly run across the road and get to work on the sign while the others kept a lookout. Carl and I had our doors ajar when one girl goes, "What's that?" Carl and I whip our heads around and see this looming silhouette about 12 feet from the car. It's dark. We're still in the mind that we're going to steal this sign, but we also don't want to get shot or in trouble. We stare at it. It doesn't move. This silhouette is about 10 feet tall with pointy ears. Think a Great Dane. "Is it a scarecrow?" the girl asks. "I don't know. I didn't notice it when I came in," I said. "It kind of looks like a dog, actually." "Oh my god, a dog? Nah, I'm getting out of here, mate." Carl was terrified of dogs. I asked him to just get the sign real quick, and that there were no dogs that tall, but Carl wasn't having any of it. He was petrified. I told him that it wasn't even moving, and at that moment it cocked its head to the side. Had I been the driver, I would have turned on the headlights, or at least something to know what it was. But everyone was freaked out, and Sam slammed the car in reverse and peeled out of there as fast as they could. I think about that night on and off. Going by logic, I assumed it was something like a llama, which isn't uncommon for the area, but llamas don't get 10 feet tall. Another theory was a horse, but it wasn't nearly wide enough, possibly emaciated. But there was no indication of a mane in this silhouette, and the head cocked to the side offered no indication of a long snout. I'm still not sure what it was, and it's left me baffled for years. A few years ago, my aunt and I were driving through this really remote part of New York when we saw something super creepy. Imagine it. It was pouring with rain, and the Erie Canal was barely visible through the thick trees lining the road. Out of nowhere, this guy suddenly appeared on the side of the canal, like he was about to step onto the road. He was wearing a corduroy shirt and ripped pants, completely drenched, and the left side of his body was all messed up, like raw meat, like something straight out of a horror movie. As we passed by, he just stared at us with this blank look, not asking for help or anything, and as we drove away, he vanished. I freaked out and asked my aunt if she saw him too, and she did. There was literally nothing else around, no cars, no houses, nothing. It didn't make sense where he came from or where he was going, and the fact he wasn't freaking out or anything made it even stranger. He just stood there staring as we drove by. After we got home, I tried looking up accidents in the area but found nothing. When I shared the story online, some people suggested his injuries might be from a motorcycle accident, and my aunt, who had been riding bikes for years, thought that sounded plausible. But to this day I still have no idea what we saw, and it's something I'll never forget. It's one of those things that just sticks with you, you know? Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. If you did, I'd appreciate knowing down below. I'd like to extend a special thanks as well to my members and patrons whose names can't be seen on screen. For signing up, they get some cool perks which might interest you. But until next time guys, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.